Good afternoon, and thank you for joining me. My name is Chef Katie Wojciechowski. I'm one of several chefs at Marcel's Culinary Experience, which is located downtown Glen Ellyn. Today we are going to talk about risotto, and more importantly, a butternut squash risotto, really tying into our weather changing here in a really nice fall dish for us. Today we're going to go through the steps of making the risotto. You will get a copy of the recipe as well. Your recipe is written to feed about 4 to 6 people, depending on if you choose to use this as a main dish. It's going to feed closer to that 4 per person. If you use it as a side dish, you can stretch it out for about 6 people. So I hope you enjoy our little video tutorial today as we go through. I'm going to actually turn on my pan and get my oil started to get warm for me. I am using, if you can see here, I am using a cast iron pan to make my risotto. So just like we lean towards cast iron to make our stews, our chilies, things like that, risotto also lends itself to producing just a really great flavor in a pan that's got thicker sides, thicker than a traditional stainless steel pan. So if you have a cast iron at home, whether it's a saucepan shaped like this or a traditional Dutch oven, like traditionally a Le Creuset, those are what you're gonna wanna gravitate towards to make your risotto even more successful. So all I have, you can see I've got kind of a medium to high heat on my burner, and I just have a little bit of oil in the burner. So the first thing with this dish is we are just going to start sauteing some just onion, some diced onion, which I went ahead and prepped ahead of time. But you can see here, we've got medium to larger dice on the onion. So that is a preference for me. So I like to see my onion in my risotto. I like to know that it is incorporated in the dish. If you are just looking to have the onion start your flavor profile, you may want to dice this a little bit smaller. So whenever I teach, I always try and tell people, remember that a recipe is just a guideline. So I'm going to teach you today the way I like it, but the onion being a perfect example. If you like a smaller dice or less of an onion, by all means make that adaptation when you go to cook. All right, so I don't know if you can hear it, but we're starting to make a little bit of a sizzle here, which is exactly what I'm looking for. The next thing we're going to talk about is actually the rice for risotto. It's called an arborio rice, and it is shorter. It's kind of a short, flat granule. You can see that. So this is really important to use because it actually has a higher starch content. So when we think of risotto, we think of creamy richness, and that actually comes out of our rice here. Having said that, the word risotto itself is a technique. So you could use orzo-shaped pasta, if you're familiar with that. That also has a high starch content, similar in shape, and you can use the same risotto technique. That word and that technique means to draw the starch out. So again, anything with starch will be able to produce somewhat of this creamy technique. The best, though, is going to be a traditional arborio rice or an orzo pasta. So I'm not looking for much color on my onion either. I'm just trying to get it soft, and I'm trying to start layering those flavors. So I'm just checking on it now. And then I'm going to actually pour in my uncooked arborio rice. And you want to incorporate the rice and the onion and the oil. Make sure everything is stirred together, otherwise you'll have some clumping in your risotto if the rice isn't evenly coated in the oil and that nice onion. That's all I'm looking for here. The next thing that's going to go in is our stock, and I want to talk briefly about the difference between chicken stock and chicken broth. There is a difference. Chicken stock is traditionally deeper in color, and that is when you are taking the actual chicken and you're adding in vegetables with the water and letting it cook on the stove top. So a lot of times that deepens the color. It also deepens the flavor of it. Chicken broth is traditionally just the water and the chicken. It's going to be lighter in color, but a much more pure chicken flavor. So that is a preference for you. I tend to lean more towards stock. I tend to make it at home every time we have a roast chicken, so I almost always have it stored away in my freezer. So if you notice that your stock or broth is a different color than mine, it could be that difference because I'm using a stock and you may have chosen a broth at home, which is perfectly fine. So the trick with risotto, and I'm gonna pull you guys closer in just a minute here. I'm gonna add in a little bit of my stock. And I'm gonna bring you guys over to the stove top here with me. You can see in there, I am bubbling away, and that's exactly what I'm looking for. Okay? So you want to continue to simmer that. The trick with risotto, though, is to never have all of that stock or broth, the liquid, completely gone and absorbed before you add your next round of liquid. So we're always adding a little bit at a time. Depending on how much you're making your recipe, I usually say about 1/4 of a cup to 1/3 of a cup at a time, and then maintaining that heat. Again, if you can see, it's like at a medium to higher heat. And we're gonna let this absorb. Not only are we cooking the rice, yes, but the slower process of stirring and the slow addition of liquid is what happens, is the technique of drawing that starch out and getting our rice cooked into the risotto method with that really creamy texture. I'm gonna do another addition of liquid here before I keep talking to you a little bit about our butternut squash. Again, just adding about 1/4 of a cup to 1/3 of a cup at a time. Okay, let's talk squash. So I happen to grow it in my garden, in my personal garden at home. So the squash I'm using today is from my garden. I went and picked it. This year we had an incredible crop. So I actually have butternut squash everything, I feel like, on my table. For this particular dish, we're gonna cube the butternut squash, and it is going to stay in its raw form. So my kids always think I've left like cheese cubes out on the table, but it's really raw butternut squash. So that's about the size that we're working with. We're gonna add it into our pot here to start cooking in just a minute. The thing with squash, if you've worked with it before, it is a denser vegetable, so it does need time to soften. Think of like a potato, sweet potato or a regular russet or Yukon potato. They need time, right, to cook and get nice and soft for us. So this butternut squash is going to be the same way. So at this point, we're still simmering. We still have liquid in our pan. My rice is not cooked, but I am going to add in the diced butternut squash. Again, in this particular risotto, the squash needs time to cook, so it's added at an earlier stage. If you were, if it was a beautiful summer day, which at my house currently it is not, it is a very cool fall day, but if it's a beautiful summer day and you were adding in things like zucchini or even like a roasted tomato, those items are typically added into a risotto towards the end when the rice has cooked, because they don't need much time to actually cook themselves. Addition of squash is going in. Again, I'm gonna give this a nice stir. Same concept with our rice. We wanna make sure we don't have clumps of squash stuck somewhere. And it's actually time to add a little bit more stock. I made a little bit of a mess. while this is working and cooking for us a little bit, I actually want to talk to you about the squash. So like I said, I literally just pulled mine out of the garden here today. So he's got this funny end on him. When you're buying a squash, I really hope you can tell what color it is. It's a lighter color. It shouldn't be like a dark orange like a pumpkin. If the squash is that color, it will have a more pumpkin-y flavor to it. It also tends to have more seeds inside. So it's gonna be, you're actually gonna get yet less yield out of it by the time you break it down and process it, because the seeds we're not going to be using. Again, just like any other vegetable, it has two ends. Both will end up being removed. The difference with the squash is it's got a thicker skin on it. However, a potato peeler does still go through and peel it. So you're gonna remove both ends of your squash, which I will do quickly here. And I wanna show you here, I actually cut it off right where it was starting to become a bell shape, if you can see that. This is not garbage. You can also peel this and cut away some of the flesh and leave the seeds intact. That's really important. But I work with one piece at a time, and I use a traditional Y peeler. If you have a straight peeler, that will work as well. I just tend to prefer this Y peeler. So I literally just peel it, just this outside layer here. You can see that coming off there. You don't want to go too deep into the squash. You can see this is a richer color than this here. That's fine. You're just taking this outer skin layer off because it's tough and really is not edible, okay? Then you'll go ahead and process and dice it, which is the point where we add it here in our risotto. Which I'm gonna bring you guys over to take a look at what's going on in my pot here. Can we see? All right, so our beautiful risotto, this nice squash is cooking in here, and there is liquid in the bottom of the pan still. So I am not going to add any more liquid yet. What I am going to do though is start seasoning with a little bit of kosher salt. Just like we're cooking anything else, as we start to layer in different flavors, if you start seasoning now, actually, when you get to the end and you taste it for seasoning, you'll realize that you've actually added less salt if you add to each layer as opposed to adding at the very end. So again, I'm using a kosher salt today. And to be honest, I use a kosher salt for everything. I added about a tablespoon, which does sound like a lot, but remember we're seasoning our onion, our risotto, our rice, excuse me, and all that cubed butternut squash. Today, as you saw when we were talking about processing and cutting up the squash, my squash is on the smaller side. That also plays into a little bit what we were talking about with its pumpkin flavor. The smaller the butternut squash, sometimes the sweeter and more tender it is. As it sits on the vine and gets larger, not only does it end up with more seeds and get a little bit more pumpkin-y in flavor, but it actually tends to be a little bit tougher and a little harder to work with. So while if you're entertaining and you're making this dish for a large group of people, you may need more butternut squash. If they're on the small side, you may need to work with maybe 3 as opposed to 2 larger ones. I think your end result is going to be so much better because it will be a nice, soft, tender, sweet butternut squash. So again, I'm just gonna check to make sure how we're doing on our liquid here. And it's looking like we need a little bit more liquid. Staying with the concept, even though that the squash is in, 1/4 of a cup to 1/3 of a cup at a time. Speaking of entertaining, as we get into these colder months and start entertaining inside our homes and making these warm, hearty dishes, risotto, I think, has a bad rap sometimes because people think you literally have to stand there in the kitchen for 25 minutes with constant stirring. It does need to be babied. I'm not gonna lie, I am standing here and you'll see me continue to stir it. However, it does have a do ahead factor to it. When you get the rice, we're actually there. When you get the rice to be about al dente, which is, it's not gonna be cooked, it's still gonna stick a little bit in your teeth. That means it's about halfway cooked. I could turn the heat off completely and allow this to sit and come to room temperature. And because there is no dairy in here yet, it can actually stay at room temperature on my stove top if I'm making it for dinner this evening. And then when my guests start to arrive and I start thinking about, wow, I really need to get this on the table, I can turn the heat back on with a little bit of liquid and finish the process. So at least you're halfway done with your risotto, as opposed to standing in the kitchen for 30 minutes while your guests are, milling about your house without your host, which I know is the most difficult thing with entertaining, right? So we are at that al dente point. I'm really hoping that our video here can capture. You can see that it's actually changed in color a little bit, the rice, and I'm gonna give it a little taste if you don't mind. It's excellent. So it tastes, I can taste a little bit of salt, but it's not salty. I don't want salt to be a flavor. I use salt to brighten my food's flavors. I don't use it as a flavor. Again, personal preference. The rice still has a little bit of stick to it in my teeth, which I know that means that it's not quite done cooking. It does still need some more liquid to it. My onion has a little bit of texture to it, but I'm not gonna say crunch either. It's all gonna stay soft. And you can see the creaminess starting to happen in my pan here. I am gonna go ahead and add, again, a little bit of liquid. The other thing going in this dish, while this works for me, is blue cheese. I happen to be a blue cheese lover. Crumbled blue cheese, you're gonna end up using about 4 ounces. Again, this is a personal preference. You can use less blue cheese if you're not as big of a fan. You could use more blue cheese if you absolutely love it. Just remember that it is very much a flavor, a bold flavor. The other option for you, well, I have a couple ideas. If you like blue cheese, but it can be overpowering, or you're serving guests and you're not quite sure if they love it, you can switch to a gorgonzola. A gorgonzola does give you that blue veining and that nice tanginess that blue cheese gives you, but it's not nearly as potent. So that would be a good choice. The other choice would be a goat cheese. It's actually a dairy-free option too if you're serving a guest with some dietary restrictions, but goat cheese has that really nice tang and creaminess too, like your blue cheese does. I do have a student of mine who took this recipe and she said that she actually used a Boursin cheese in it, which if you're not familiar, it is a softer cheese like goat cheese, but it has some herbs already in it. And I believe a little bit of garlic as well too. So again, a recipe is just a guideline. Remember that. Today we are going to use a crumbled blue cheese. And you do want this cheese to be melted throughout here. This is the point where I am going to actually reduce my heat to be a lower heat. You can see my burner. If you can tell, that did go down to a medium-low heat on my burner. Remember too, with heat control, you are using cast iron, so it gets hot and it stays hot. Even if I were to turn this burner off, it would continue to simmer and sizzle because that pan itself is so hot. So remember that. So about halfway through the process, we still have an al dente rice. We're reducing our heat, and then we're going to add in our blue cheese. All the crumbles are gonna go in here. And now I'm gonna stir this up again. And I I'd like to bring you guys over again to take a look. We are needing a little bit more liquid, and then we want to taste our rice to make sure that we are cooked all the way through. Do you see the creaminess happening in here? Okay. All right. A little bit more liquid like we talked about. When speaking of salt, I know we're going back a little bit, but when you're seasoning before you've added the cheese, remember that all cheese actually has a natural saltiness to it. So depending on what your blue cheese is that you're working with or what your favorite is, that will also determine how much salt you need to add. So again, just about a half a tablespoon to a tablespoon to start the flavor going. If you know that you are using a really salty cheese, sometimes our Spanish cheeses, tend to actually have like salt crystals in them, which they're absolutely to die for if you're a blue cheese lover. However, you don't want to oversalt your dish if that is what you're going to be finishing with, if that makes sense. The other thing that we are going to finish this dish with is hazelnuts. So we are using a crushed hazelnut, which mine are just finely chopped here. You can see that. A hazelnut is also called a filibert. They are wildly popular in these fall seasons. A lot of baking with hazelnuts. If you buy them whole with the shell on, they tend to be lower in price, but you have a little bit of work to do. And I'm just talking a little bit, I'm gonna check our rice, I hear it simmering. So what I would suggest if you bought the hazelnuts whole with their skin on, it's kind of like a papery skin. If you put them on a sheet pan and roast them in the oven at 400 degrees, for about 10 to 12 minutes, when you take them out, if you put them in a clean kitchen towel, so you'd actually dump all of your hazelnuts in here. We'll just pretend that these are shelled hazelnuts. And then kind of make almost like a little beggar's purse and aggressively wrap at the nuts. That papery shell will come off for you, and then you can run your knife through to chop those up. So I love the hazelnuts in this dish. First of all, the blue cheese, the butternut squash, the creaminess of the risotto, and the hazelnut flavor-wise all play well together. For me though, when we think of risotto, we think of that creamy texture, and it tends to be soft. Our butternut squash is also getting nice and soft and tender in here. While it will have a little bit of a chew through it, it will still be softer in texture. So I love the hazelnut to finish because it gives it a nice crunch. So as you're diving into this creamy deliciousness, you still get a texture and a little bit of a crunch. I'm gonna add them at the very end though. I wanna make sure right now that our rice is completely cooked through and we're checking for seasoning. And again, like we talked about with salt, I just wanna make sure all my flavors are highlighted in this dish and nice and bright. And then I also am gonna add some fresh cracked pepper. Again, that's a personal preference. I love black pepper cracked through my dishes. You could use a little bit of white pepper in here too. So those are a couple options for you, and you don't have to use pepper either if it's offensive to you and your taste buds. Just eliminate the pepper. So good thing I'm cooking for myself today because I'm going to use this spatula. It's great. It's creamy. My rice is cooked through. I have the flavor of the blue cheese in the background. I personally don't think it needs any salt at this point. The blue cheese is holding quite a bit of that flavor for me. But again, like I said, I am gonna add some fresh cracked pepper through it. Looks like my pepper grinder needs to be refilled too while I'm at it. Again, stirring all of this through. Now the addition of the hazelnuts. Again, mine have been roasted and peeled and chopped. Make sure yours are too. That papery skin that we talked about taking off is just a really unpleasant mouthfeel. Okay. Stirring these hazelnuts through here before we go and plate up. I'm just using our traditional low soup bowl. You can see that here today. I think it helps our risotto. I will tell you a secret. When my colleague was in Italy, he took a class on risotto and then came home and shared a video with us very similar to this video. And he always said in Italy they put a little bit of pool of some of our stock that we didn't use in the bottom of the pan. So we will do that. Turn my heat off and then layer in some of this delicious risotto. Clean up my plate here. I made a little bit of a mess. And then I have some hazelnuts left over that I would like to just kind of garnish the top with. And if you can see here, this is going to be our completed butternut squash, blue cheese, and hazelnut creamy risotto. I can't thank you enough for joining me with this video. I really hope that you enjoy this recipe and happy cooking. Thank you.